Harwick existed the way a barnacle existed, which is to say, it clung to its particular surface with a tenacity that had nothing to do with affection, and everything to do with the fact that it had been there long enough, that leaving would require more effort than staying, and the people of Harwick, Maine were not people who expended effort unnecessarily. The town sat at the end of a peninsula that jutted into the Atlantic, like a finger pointing at something offshore that nobody had ever been able to identify. And the road that connected it to the rest of coastal Maine was a two-lane affair that flooded badly in the spring and iced terribly in the winter, and was in a general state of negotiation with the surrounding landscape for the remaining 8 weeks of the year, when neither of those conditions fully applied. Travelers from the mainland, of which there were not many, had a tendency to look at the road sign for Harwick, and then look at the condition of the road itself, and then make the entirely reasonable decision to continue to Bar Harbor or Camden or any of the other coastal Maine towns that had made more of a commercial commitment to being found by people who were looking. Harwick had not made this commitment. Harwick was in the specific Maine coastal tradition of towns that had been fishing settlements before tourism was a concept, and that had never seen any compelling reason to update their relationship with the outside world thoroughly and deliberately itself. The lobster boats went out in the morning and came back in the afternoon, and the catch went to the processor at the south end of the harbor, and the processor sent it wherever processed lobster went, which the people of Harwick knew was somewhere else, and were satisfied with the knowledge stopping there. What the outside world did with Harwick's lobster was the outside world's business. What Harwick did with the money the outside world sent back was Harwick's business. This arrangement had worked for 140 years, and nobody saw any reason to complicate it. The town proper was built around a harbor that was practical rather than picturesque, though it had a way of being both at certain times of year when the light cooperated and the fog was behaving itself. The fish processing facility occupied the south end of the harbor, as previously mentioned, and occupied also a certain amount of the town's sensory experience regardless of wind direction, which was something the people of Harwick had stopped noticing decades ago in the way that you stopped noticing the smell of a place you lived in and only registered it again when you had been away long enough for it to become remarkable rather than ambient. The harbor itself was crescent-shaped, the curve of it lined with the working infrastructure of a fishing community, docks and moorings, and the various structures that supported the business of getting boats into and out of the water in varying states of urgency. There was a chandlery that sold everything from marine hardware to rubber boots to a selection of canned goods that could sustain a person through a moderately serious emergency. There was a small restaurant called the Anchor that served breakfast and lunch, and closed at 2 in the afternoon on the entirely reasonable grounds that the people who ate there had been up since 4 in the morning and were done with the day by then. There was a post office that was also the pharmacy that was also on Tuesday afternoons, the town's de facto administrative center, when Selectman Gerald Pierce brought his paperwork from his kitchen table and worked on it at the counter while Doris Blanchard ran the pharmacy portion of the enterprise and generally kept things moving. Behind the harbor, the town climbed the hillside in the way of coastal Maine towns that had been built before anyone thought carefully about the relationship between topography and convenience, the houses stepping up the slope in a way that required residents to maintain a certain level of physical fitness simply by virtue of living there. The houses were the colors that houses in coastal Maine were when they had been painted once a generation by people who valued durability over fashion, which is to say they were white and gray, and a particular shade of weathered blue that was not chosen so much as arrived at through the accumulated effect of wind and salt air on whatever color had originally been applied. At the top of the hill where the town ran out of slope and settled onto a flat stretch before the spruce forest began, there was the church and there was the cemetery, and there was set back from both at a distance that felt deliberate without being impolite. The house of Theodore Marsh. Theodore Marsh was the reason we are telling this story, and we will get to him in due course. But first we must tell you about the other people of Harwick, because Theodore Marsh's story was not separable from their stories, or rather his story was the thing that made their stories visible, in the way that certain kinds of light make things visible that ordinary light passed right through. Among the fishing families of Harwick, there was none more established than the Vances. The Vances had been fishing out of Harwick Harbor since the 1880s, and the current representative of this tradition was a man named Douglas Vance, who was 53 years old and who had been fishing lobster since he was old enough to be useful on a boat, which in his family was approximately 7. Douglas was a large man in the specific way of men who had done physical work their whole lives. The largeness distributed across him in a way that was functional rather than imposing, though it could be imposing when the occasion called for it, and Douglas had no difficulty making it do so. He had hands that could have been used as evidence in a textbook about what decades of hauling lobster traps did to hands. He had a face that the Atlantic had worked on for 50 years with wind and salt and cold, and which had developed in response the specific weathered quality of someone who had come to terms with the weather, having opinions, and had decided to have an equally strong opinion back. Douglas was the most respected man in Harwick, which was an honor he carried with the slight discomfort of someone who had been given a gift they didn't particularly want, but couldn't return without causing offense. People came to him with disputes and disagreements, and the various interpersonal tangles that small communities generated, and he resolved them with the patient practicality of someone who understood that most problems were really the same problem dressed in different clothes, and that the solution to most problems was the same solution applied with varying degrees of firmness, depending on the particular clothing. What the people of Harwick did not know about Douglas Vance was that for the past 11 years he had been systematically and deliberately misreporting his catch weights to the processor at the south end of the harbor. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have set off alarms in anyone who was paying careful attention, though no one was paying careful attention, which was partly why he had been doing it for 11 years. He reported 83 to 86% of his actual catch and kept the remainder, which he sold through a private arrangement with a buyer in Rockland whose name Douglas had no interest in learning because the arrangement worked better when the names stayed out of it and the cash came in an envelope, and the envelope arrived on the first of each month without requiring either party to acknowledge the other's existence. The reason Douglas had started the practice 11 years ago was a reason that had made perfect sense at the time, which was that his daughter Claire had needed braces, and the cost of orthodontia for a 13-year-old's teeth was a thing that could make a working fisherman look at his options with a certain creative flexibility. He had solved the Claire problem and then found that the arrangement was in place and working smoothly, and that the money was useful for various things that life produced, and that stopping the arrangement would require an acknowledgement that the arrangement had existed, which was a conversation he was not interested in having with the processor's accounting department or with himself. Claire now had excellent teeth and was a dental hygienist in Portland. She came home for Christmas and sometimes Thanksgiving, and Douglas was always glad to see her, and she was always glad to see him, and neither of them had any idea that her smile, which her father had gone to some lengths to ensure, had also been the origin of a systematic fraud that had been running quietly for over a decade. Douglas sat on this knowledge the way you sat on a thing you had long since stopped thinking of as a secret and had reclassified as simply a feature of your life, the way you stopped thinking of the smell of the harbor as a smell and started thinking of it as the air. Not far from the Vance property, in one of the weathered blue houses partway up the hill, lived Agnes Croft, who was 71 years old and who had been Harwick's postmistress and pharmacist for 37 years, which was the longest anyone had held both positions simultaneously, and which had given her an understanding of the town's medical and personal correspondence that was, to put it plainly, comprehensive. Agnes was a small woman of the kind that compact people sometimes became when they had spent their lives being efficient. She had organized herself down to the essentials. Over the years, the unnecessary things fallen away the way excess weight fell away from anyone who worked consistently, until what remained was a very precise and very effective human being, with bright gray eyes and a posture that suggested she had made an early decision about what kind of person she was going to be, and had not revisited it since. She was liked by everyone in Harwick in the specific way that a person who held their position of knowledge carefully and without weaponizing it was liked, which was with a mixture of genuine affection and the background awareness that this was a person you wanted to stay on the right side of. Agnes knew a great deal about the people of Harwick. This was not something she had sought out. It was a consequence of her position. A person who filled prescriptions for an entire town for 37 years, and also received and distributed all of that town's mail, was going to accumulate information, whether she wanted to or not. She knew who was on what medication and had known for years. She knew which medications were the kind you didn't mention out loud in a town this small. She knew who received letters from lawyers and who received letters from debt collection agencies, and who received letters from the kind of medical facilities that people in small towns preferred not to advertise their relationship with. She kept this knowledge with the scrupulous discretion of a professional who understood that discretion was the only thing standing between her position and the complete collapse of everyone's willingness to do business with her. She never spoke of what she knew. She filed it away in the specific mental filing system she had developed over the course of her career, and she left the files alone, unless there was a compelling reason to consult them, which there very seldom was. What Agnes had never told anyone was that she had, over the course of 37 years, been quietly supplementing the prescriptions she dispensed with a slight reduction in the actual medication provided. Not dangerously, not in amounts that would have caused any measurable harm to anyone. The pills were always the right pills. The dosages were always technically within a range that could be attributed to normal variation in tablet manufacturing, and the difference between what the prescriptions called for and what Agnes actually dispensed was small enough to be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it specifically. The reason she had started was the same kind of practical problem that started many things of this nature, which was that pharmaceutical procurement for a small-town pharmacy in the 1990s was a business with margins that occasionally required creative management. The reason she had continued was the same reason Douglas Vance had continued his arrangement, which was that stopping required an acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement required a conversation, and Agnes had never identified the conversation she was willing to have about it. The accumulated difference over 37 years was small in aggregate, and Agnes had told herself this many times and continued to find it convincing. Nobody had ever come to any harm that she could trace to the practice. The medicines worked. The people were well. The math was the math, and if the math happened to work out slightly in her favor, well, the pharmacy had kept the town's medical needs met for nearly 4 decades, and that was worth something that didn't appear anywhere in the accounting. This was what Agnes told herself when she thought about it, which was not often. The spiritual life of Harwick was overseen by Reverend Susan Hale, who had come to the town's Congregational Church 12 years ago from a larger congregation in Bangor, and who had brought with her a warm and practical faith that suited Harwick's temperament considerably better than her predecessor's tendency toward doctrinal abstraction. People in Harwick were not interested in doctrine. They were interested in birth and death and marriage, and the specific comfort of a weekly gathering that reminded them they belonged to something larger than their own households. And Reverend Hale provided this with a competence and a genuine warmth that the congregation valued, even if they expressed the valuing in the reserved way of coastal Maine Congregationalists, which was by continuing to show up every Sunday and by not finding anything to complain about. Reverend Hale was 55 years old and had the healthy, pink-cheeked look of someone who walked every morning regardless of the weather, which she did along the harbor road and back. A constitutional that she had maintained for all 12 years of her time in Harwick, and that had given her a thorough knowledge of the town's physical geography, and also a reputation for being reliably visible at 6:30 in the morning if anyone needed to speak to her, which occasionally they did. She was a good pastor. She listened well. She kept confidences without apparent difficulty. She visited the sick and the grieving with a consistency that required real effort in a town spread across a hillside in the Maine winter, and she made the effort without complaint and without keeping any visible tally of it. What Reverend Hale had not told her congregation was that she had stopped believing in God approximately 4 years into her tenure in Harwick. It had not been a dramatic loss. There had been no crisis of faith, no single event that had undone 12 years of seminary and 23 years of ministry. It had been slower than that, more like a tide going out than a wave breaking, the belief withdrawing gradually over time until one morning she had walked the harbor road and realized mid-step that the internal conversation she had been having with God for 40 years had become a conversation she was having with herself. She had stopped walking. She had stood on the harbor road in the October cold and looked at the Atlantic and waited for the feeling to come back, and it hadn't come back. And she had stood there long enough that Douglas Vance had come down to his dock for something, and had seen her standing there and had come over to ask if she was all right. She had said she was fine. She had resumed her walk. She had given the following Sunday's sermon on the subject of faith in the absence of certainty, and it had been one of the best sermons she had ever given, partly because it was completely honest in a way that she could not afford to have the congregation know. She had considered leaving. She had thought about it seriously and at length. She had concluded that she could not leave without explaining why, and she could not explain why without causing a harm to the congregation that felt disproportionate to the relief it would have provided her. She had chosen to stay and to continue doing the work, which she could do well and genuinely regardless of the metaphysics of it, and she had made her peace with this arrangement, in the way that you made peace with things by deciding that the peace was the best available option, and acting accordingly. She told herself that what she offered the congregation was real, even if the foundation of it had shifted. She told herself that the comfort and the community and the structure of the weekly gathering mattered and served genuine human needs, regardless of whether there was anything on the other side of the prayers. She told herself these things every Sunday morning as she put on her vestments and went out to the pulpit, and she had gotten very good at telling herself them convincingly. She had not, however, gotten completely comfortable with the idea of being definitively proven right or wrong. The harbor master of Harwick was a man named Walter Briggs, who had held this position for 22 years, and who was in the estimation of most people who dealt with him professionally excellent at it. He knew the harbor the way you knew something you had watched every day for 2 decades. The tides and the channels and the particular behavior of vessels in the specific wind patterns that the peninsula generated, and he managed the coming and going of Harwick's small fishing fleet with the calm authority of someone who had seen enough go wrong to be reliably useful when things did. Walter was 60 years old and had the particular quality of slowness that efficient people sometimes developed the appearance of doing things unhurriedly that was actually the result of never doing anything twice, because everything was done correctly the first time. He was not a man who wasted motion or words, and the people of Harwick appreciated this about him in the same way they appreciated foghorns and channel markers, which was that they didn't think about it consciously, but they would have noticed very quickly if it stopped working. Walter's secret was more recent than Douglas's or Agnes's, which in some ways made it worse because it hadn't had time to calcify into something he had stopped thinking about. 14 months ago, a lobster boat called the Eleanor May had come into Harwick Harbor on a February morning with a problem in its steering that Walter had assessed and determined was beyond what could be fixed with the harbor's available resources. And the Eleanor May and its captain, a man from a neighboring town named Phil Courtney, had spent 3 days in Harwick while the necessary part was ordered and shipped. Phil Courtney was not a notable man in any respect, except that he had a way of talking about the lobster fishery that gave Walter information he had not previously had. Specifically information about a stretch of bottom about 14 miles offshore that Courtenay had been working for 3 seasons with considerably better results than the conventional wisdom about that territory suggested were possible. The information was shared in the easy way that fishermen sometimes shared information about their grounds when they were in a port that wasn't their own, and the competition wasn't direct. Walter had listened and had thanked Courtenay and had not passed the information along to the Harwick fleet, which he absolutely should have done in his capacity as harbor master, and which he had not done because he had, in the 2 weeks following Courtenay's visit, quietly relayed the coordinates to his brother-in-law Ray, who ran a boat out of a harbor 20 miles up the coast, and who had spent the following season doing considerably better than his previous seasons, a portion of which improvement he had expressed gratitude for in a way that was not cash, but was a substantial number of very pleasant evenings at Ray's cottage, and some material assistance with a project Walter had been putting off for years. Walter told himself that it wasn't as though the information had been secret. Courtenay had shared it freely. Walter had simply passed it along to someone who wasn't in direct competition with the Harwick fleet, rather than passing it along to people who were. This argument was technically available, and Walter had deployed it several times in the privacy of his own thoughts, without ever fully convincing himself. Beside all of these people, and in some ways because of all of these people, there was Theodore Marsh. Theodore Marsh was 47 years old and had lived in Harwick his entire life, without ever quite belonging to it in the way that the other residents belonged to it, which was the way of people whose families had been there for generations, and who shared a history so dense and so specific that it functioned like a language, full of references and shorthand that only made sense if you had been there for the early chapters. Theodore had been born in Harwick and raised in Harwick and had gone to the Harwick school and had known everyone in the town his whole life and had still never managed to feel like he was from there in the marrow of it. Part of this was his disposition, which was the disposition of someone who observed things rather than participated in them, who stood slightly outside whatever was happening and watched it, and thought about it rather than simply being inside it. Part of it was his profession, which was that he was a pharmacognosist, which was a word that required explanation in most contexts, and that he had given up explaining in favor of saying he was an herbalist, which was both true and insufficient, and which caused people to nod in a way that meant they understood what they thought he meant, but did not understand what he actually meant. A pharmacognosist was, in the formal academic sense, a scientist who studied natural substances with medicinal properties, their chemistry and their pharmacology, and their interactions with biological systems. Theodore had a degree from the University of Maine and a second degree from a program in Vermont, and a substantial library that occupied 2 of the 3 upstairs rooms of his house at the edge of the spruce forest, and that contained volumes in English and Latin, and 1 shelf of German texts that he had taught himself to read specifically because several of the authors he most needed to understand had not been translated. He worked officially as a consultant to various pharmaceutical and nutraceutical companies that sent him samples and questions and paid him adequately, if not extravagantly, for his analysis and his opinions. He maintained a small garden on the south side of his house, where he grew the plants that didn't grow reliably in coastal Maine's climate in the uncontrolled outdoors. He took long walks on the headlands and in the spruce forest, and had developed over the years an encyclopedic knowledge of what grew where in the 50 square miles around Harwick, knowledge that existed at the intersection of scientific precision and something older that he didn't have a precise word for. The people of Harwick regarded Theodore with the specific affection that communities developed for their resident eccentric, which was a mixture of genuine fondness and a slight protective instinct, as if he were something that needed to be managed carefully to remain benign. They brought him things they found in the woods and along the shore, and asked him what they were. He told them accurately, and they thanked him and went away having learned something and having confirmed their general sense of him as a person who knew a great deal about the natural world and very little about anything else. This was not an entirely accurate picture of Theodore Marsh, but it was not entirely inaccurate either. What Theodore had been working on for the past 2 years in the evenings after his consulting work was done, and on the weekends when the garden wasn't demanding his attention was a formula. He did not call it a formula in his notes. He called it a preparation, which was the older word from the tradition of the apothecaries and the herbalists who had been doing this kind of work before the disciplines that would eventually systematize it had developed their vocabulary. The preparation was in the most direct available language, a compound derived from several plant sources, including 2 that were not widely recognized in the formal pharmacological literature that had, in Theodore's careful and methodical testing, demonstrated a consistent and reproducible effect on the human body that he was still, after 2 years of documentation, reluctant to describe in the direct terms it deserved. The effect was this: it made people tell the truth. Not compulsively, not in the Hollywood sense of a truth serum, the theatrical inability to say anything false, regardless of consequences or context. The mechanism was subtler than that and considerably more interesting from a scientific standpoint, which was part of why Theodore had spent 2 years documenting it before he was willing to do anything with the documentation. What the preparation did was lower what Theodore thought of as the cost of truth-telling. Every person walked around with a continuous unconscious calculation, running in the background, the calculation of what the social and personal cost of saying a particular true thing was versus the cost of not saying it. And this calculation was usually conducted in favor of not saying it because the cost of silence was diffuse and abstract, while the cost of revelation was specific and immediate. The preparation didn't eliminate this calculation. It changed the parameters of it in a way that made the cost of silence feel slightly higher and the cost of revelation feel slightly lower. And in this altered state, people tended to say things they wouldn't ordinarily say, not because they were compelled to, but because in the moment it seemed to make more sense. The effect lasted 4 to 6 hours, depending on body weight and metabolic rate, and a few other variables Theodore had been tracking. It was apparently harmless from a physiological standpoint, based on his testing, which had involved himself and 2 undergraduate researchers from the University of Maine, who had signed appropriate consent forms and who had spent 6 hours each saying things to Theodore that they would not ordinarily have said, some of which were interesting, and some of which were personal, and all of which were apparently true. The preparation tasted like something between licorice and salt air, which Theodore considered fitting for a product developed in coastal Maine, and it could be added to any beverage without detectably altering the flavor, which was a property Theodore had noted in his documentation with the careful neutrality of someone who understood the ethical implications and was recording the fact without taking a position on it. He had brought this preparation to a town council meeting in September, 2 months before the events we are about to describe, which had been his first mistake. Or perhaps not his first mistake, but the first mistake that was going to be visible to the people of Harwick in a way that mattered. He had described the preparation carefully and accurately, emphasizing its potential applications in therapeutic contexts, its documented safety profile, the peer review process. He had begun with several colleagues at the university. The council had listened with the polite but slightly glazed attention that the council gave to everything Theodore presented, which was the attention of people who had long ago categorized him as someone whose ideas were usually interesting and occasionally useful, and never immediately practical. Gerald Pierce, the selectman, had asked whether the preparation could be patented. Theodore had said probably yes. Gerald had asked what Theodore intended to do with it. Theodore had said he wanted the people of Harwick to try it first as a kind of thank you to the community that had grown the plants and provided the coastal ecosystem that had made the research possible, before he moved forward with the formal academic and commercial process. There had been a silence of the kind that occurred in council meetings when something was being considered that nobody wanted to be the first to respond to. Then Ruth Aldrich, who ran the Anchor and who had been on the council for 6 years, had said that was very generous of Theodore, and that she imagined the town would be grateful, and she had looked at the other council members, and they had nodded in the way that meant the matter was settled without anyone having to say the words that would have made it official. Theodore had gone home and prepared the vials with the careful precision of someone who had spent 2 years getting the preparation right and who was not going to rush the distribution. 26 small glass vials, one for each adult household in Harwick, with a hand-lettered label that said, Theodore Marsh, Natural Preparation Sample, and his phone number in case anyone had questions. He had delivered them the following Saturday, leaving them on doorsteps or handing them directly to whoever answered when he knocked with a brief explanation that this was the preparation he had mentioned to the council and that he hoped they would find an opportunity to try it. What he did not know at the time of this delivery was the specific contents of every secret in Harwick. He knew in the general way that a person who had lived among a group of people for 47 years knew things that the people around him were more complicated than they appeared. He had not imagined the specifics. He was a scientist, and he had a scientist's respect for complexity and a scientist's tendency to underestimate it anyway, because the full complexity of what was actually there was always more than the model could hold, and this was true of everything Theodore had ever studied. He found out about the specifics the following Sunday. That Sunday in November was the kind of day that coastal Maine produced in November, which is to say the kind of day that made you understand why the people who stayed, stayed, and the people who left the sky a flat pewter that went all the way down to the horizon without a seam, the wind off the Atlantic with an opinion in it. The spruce trees on the headlands leaning slightly in the permanent way of trees that had been having the same argument with the wind for 100 years and had lost enough of it to show. Ruth Aldrich had included the preparation in the Sunday morning coffee at the Anchor without telling anyone. She had done this because it seemed the most natural and practical way to get the sample to the people she wanted to try it, which was the morning crowd that came in after the boats were in and the catch was logged. The specific group of Harwick regulars who sat at the 4 tables near the window and drank coffee and talked about whatever needed to be talked about, and had been doing this for years. She had added approximately the suggested amount to the large coffee urn, with the efficient motion of someone adding a normal ingredient, and she had poured coffee and she had waited. She had not told anyone she was doing this because she was Ruth Aldrich, and she did what she thought was sensible without extensive consultation, which was why she had been running the Anchor for 22 years, and why it still worked. And she had thought this was sensible on the grounds that the preparation was apparently harmless, and the council had agreed it should be tried, and a group of people having coffee together was as natural an occasion as any. She had also, it must be said, included herself in the distribution by having a cup of the coffee before the doors opened, because Ruth Aldrich had never asked anyone to do something she wasn't willing to do herself, which was another reason the Anchor had lasted 22 years. The preparation worked, as Theodore had documented it working. It worked on Douglas Vance, who was sitting at the table by the window. He always sat at with Walter Briggs and 2 other fishermen, and who had been talking about the season's catch, and had found himself, to his own evident surprise, continuing to talk about the catch in a way that included information about the catch that he did not ordinarily discuss in public. Specifically the portion of the catch that went to the Rockland arrangement. He had gotten about 4 sentences into this supplementary disclosure before he had stopped and looked at his coffee cup, and then looked around the table. Walter Briggs across the table had by this point been in the middle of saying something about harbor traffic that had taken an unexpected turn toward a description of the coordinates he had passed along to his brother-in-law, and why he had made that decision, and what he thought about it now, 14 months later, in the soberer light of extended reflection. They had looked at each other. The 2 other fishermen at the table had not said anything compromising, which was either because they had nothing compromising to say, or because the preparation hadn't had time to work yet, or because the specific parameters of their individual calculations had come out differently than Douglas's and Walter's. They were, however, looking at Douglas and Walter with the focused attention of people who were hearing something interesting and weren't sure yet whether to be alarmed by it. At the table by the door, Reverend Hale had come in after her morning walk and had accepted the coffee Ruth Aldrich handed her, and had sat down and had been talking to Agnes Croft about a parishioner who was having a difficult time, and the conversation had migrated in the space of about 10 minutes from the pastoral general to the pastoral specific to a description of Reverend Hale's inner life that she had not described to anyone in 4 years, including the part about the Harbor Road in October, and the conversation with herself that had turned out to be only with herself, and what she had done with this realization and whether she thought it had been the right thing. Agnes had listened to this with the expression of someone who was receiving a great deal of information very quickly and was processing it in real time with her pharmacy-trained correspondence-managed assessment of human complexity. She had then said several things in response that were truer than the things she ordinarily said, including a summary of the prescription practice that had been running in the background of her professional life for 37 years. She had said it in the tone of someone reading from a document they had been meaning to address and hadn't gotten around to. Ruth Aldrich, behind the counter, heard pieces of all of this as she moved between the tables and the coffee station. She was because of the cup she had drunk before opening, in the same altered state as everyone else, and she found herself telling Doris Blanchard, who had come in for breakfast, about a practice she had maintained in the anchor's bookkeeping that had nothing to do with what is being discussed here, and that we will not describe in detail except to say that it involved the way she categorized certain business expenses, and that she had been meaning to discuss it with her accountant for several years. Theodore Marsh was not at the anchor that Sunday morning. He had delivered the vials and had gone home and had intended to let the process work on its own timeline, which was what his documentation suggested was the appropriate approach. He found out what had happened from Gerald Pierce, who called him at 2 in the afternoon. Gerald's voice on the phone had the quality of someone who had spent the intervening hours doing a great deal of thinking and had arrived at a position and was now delivering it. Gerald said, "Theodore, your preparation, the one you gave to Ruth, she put it in the coffee at the anchor this morning. Theodore said he saw." Gerald said, "A number of things were said this morning that I imagine the people who said them are reconsidering this afternoon." Theodore said he imagined so. Gerald said, "I wonder if you could come to a council meeting this week and discuss the preparation in more detail, specifically its properties, and specifically whether those properties are something we want circulating in the town's food and beverage supply, without the full informed consent of everyone involved." Theodore said he could do that. He said he was sorry about the circumstances in which the information had come to light. He said the preparation had been intended to be used with full disclosure, and that he would make sure the documentation made this clear. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Theodore, I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I'm asking as someone who has known you your whole life and who has generally found your work to be worthwhile, even when it was inconvenient. What were you expecting to happen?" Theodore said he had been expecting people to experience a general sense of ease with truth-telling, and possibly to have some conversations they had been putting off, and to feel better for having had them. Gerald said, Theodore said he might have underestimated some things. Gerald said that was one way to put it. The council meeting happened on Thursday. Theodore came and presented his documentation with the thorough precision that was his natural mode. The council listened. Agnes Croft was there, and she was quieter than usual. Douglas Vance was there, and he had the demeanor of someone who had spent the week in a productive state of moral reckoning. Walter Briggs had written a letter to his brother-in-law that he had not sent yet, but that he was going to send. Reverend Hale was there, and she looked, Theodore thought, slightly lighter than she had looked before, the way people sometimes looked when they had put something down that they had been carrying for a long time. Ruth Aldrich was there, and she said before the formal agenda began that she owed the people present an apology for introducing the preparation into the community's coffee without consent, and that she had thought it was a reasonable decision at the time, and she was reconsidering that assessment. Gerald Pierce said he appreciated that and moved on. The formal agenda item was what to do with the remaining vials and with the preparation generally. Theodore said the remaining vials could be returned to him, and the documentation could proceed through the normal academic and commercial channels, and that he would be more careful in the future about the distinction between scientific interest and community impact. Someone asked whether the preparation might have continuing therapeutic applications in carefully controlled contexts with appropriate consent. Theodore said he thought it might, and that the academic literature he was intending to publish would describe the parameters under which it appeared to work reliably. Someone else asked whether the conversations that had occurred at the Anchor the previous Sunday would need to be addressed in any formal way. There was a silence of the kind that occurred when a question contained within it several answers that were all technically correct and all inconvenient. Gerald Pierce said that Harwick had always handled its own affairs, and that he saw no reason why this should be different. There was a general settling in the room that communicated agreement without requiring anyone to say the word. The remaining vials were returned to Theodore. He catalogued them and added them to his storage and noted in his documentation that the distribution had proceeded in an uncontrolled manner, and that the results, while consistent with the preparation's documented properties, had occurred in an environment that did not meet the standards for the kind of study he had intended. He wrote this in the careful, neutral language of scientific documentation, and then sat back in his chair and looked out the window at the harbor for a while. He thought about what Gerald had asked him. What had he expected to happen? He had expected honestly that people would take their vials home and think about whether to try them, and most of them wouldn't, or they would try them and find the experience interesting and benign, and the town would feel in the aggregate slightly more comfortable with certain truths. He had expected the gradual, voluntary informed process that every ethics protocol he had ever followed called for. He had not expected Ruth Aldrich. This was perhaps his actual failure, he thought. Not the preparation itself and not the delivery of the vials, but the assumption that the intervention between the preparation and the people would be a slow and individual and chosen thing, rather than a fast and communal and unchosen thing arranged by a woman who had been running the most efficient breakfast operation in coastal Maine for 22 years, and who applied the same principles to everything she touched. He supposed he should have known better. He had lived in Harwick for 47 years. In the weeks that followed, certain things changed in Harwick, and certain things did not. Douglas Vance had a conversation with the processor's accounting department that was long and uncomfortable, and arrived at an arrangement that cost him a significant sum and required several months of adjusted reporting before the accounts were brought into a relationship with reality that both parties could live with. The Rockland buyer received a letter saying the arrangement was concluded, which was received without apparent distress, which Douglas had found somewhat deflating given the years of anxiety he had spent maintaining it. Claire called from Portland and said she had heard from a cousin that something had happened with Dad and the catch weights, and was everything all right. Douglas said everything was being sorted out. Claire said, "Okay, Dad." And that was the whole conversation, which was in many ways worse than a longer one would have been. Agnes Croft had a conversation with her own conscience that resulted in a donation to a medical fund administered by the county health department in an amount that she had calculated represented a conservative estimate of the value of the discrepancy over 37 years plus interest at a rate she had decided was fair, which was higher than the rate she could have argued for, and lower than the rate that would have required her to sell the house. She didn't tell anyone about the donation. The county health fund noted it with gratitude and some puzzlement at the anonymous nature of the contribution, and applied it to equipment for a mobile health unit that served several coastal communities, including Harwick. Reverend Hale did not leave. She had thought about it again in the weeks after the anchor, and had arrived at the same conclusion she had arrived at 4 years ago, which was that the work was real and valuable, and the metaphysics of it were her own business. She preached the following Sunday on the subject of honesty as a community practice, and it was a better sermon than it would have been if she had written it the week before, for reasons she didn't explain to the congregation, but that several of them seemed to feel anyway. Walter Briggs sent the letter to his brother-in-law, which his brother-in-law received and acknowledged with a phone call in which he said he appreciated Walter telling him, and that he'd figured there was something like that behind the coordinates, and that he hoped Walter wasn't losing too much sleep over it. Walter said he appreciated that. His brother-in-law said he'd been meaning to say that the fishing had been good, that stretch of bottom, and that maybe the information should go to the Harwick fleet, and Walter said he thought so too, and that he would take care of it. He took care of it at the next harbor meeting, and the 3 Harwick lobster boats that tried the coordinates the following season had a better season for it, which Douglas Vance attributed to luck, and which Walter Briggs attributed to justice, and which were possibly the same thing in this instance. Theodore Marsh submitted his documentation to 2 journals, the initial article appearing some months later and generating the academic interest he had anticipated. He was invited to present at 3 conferences. He politely declined the first 2 on the grounds that he had work to finish, and accepted the 3rd because it was in Maine, and he could drive there and be home the same day. He continued to walk the headlands and the spruce forest. He continued to bring back samples and press flowers into his notebooks and add entries to his records of what grew where in the 50 square miles around Harwick. He continued to deliver vials to various academic contacts, clearly labeled and accompanied by full documentation and a consent form that his university colleagues said was more thorough than it needed to be. Theodore said he preferred thorough. The vials that had been returned to him from the anchor distribution he kept in a cabinet in his second-floor library next to the German texts. He labeled them as stock and did not use them. He was not sure he would use them for anything, which was a position that surprised him slightly, given the amount of work it had taken to produce them. He had told Gerald Pierce he had underestimated some things. He thought about this description periodically and found it accurate and insufficient simultaneously, which was the way of most accurate descriptions of things that were also large. The town of Harwick went about its business. The lobster boats went out in the morning and came back in the afternoon. The catch went to the processor at the south end of the harbor. The coffee at the anchor was going forward, entirely unaugmented by anything except the standard proprietary blend that Ruth had been ordering from the same roaster in Portland for 15 years. People sat at the tables by the window and talked about what needed to be talked about. Some of what needed to be talked about was different now than it had been before November. Some of it was the same. The harbor did what harbors did. The Atlantic continued to have opinions about the wind. The spruce trees on the headlands continued their 100-year argument with the weather, leaning in the way of things that had learned to accommodate what they couldn't change. Theodore Marsh walked to the harbor on the last Sunday of November and stood on the dock for a while and watched the water. It was a pewter day, the flat gray kind, the horizon invisible, where the sky met the sea. He thought about his preparation and about what it had found in the people he had lived among for 47 years, and about whether knowing those things had changed anything in the way that he felt about them. He concluded that it had not. This surprised him less than he thought it should have. He walked back up the hill through the town, past the weathered houses, and the chandlery and the anchor with its lights on against the gray afternoon, and he went home and made tea and sat at his desk and opened his notebook to a fresh page. The town rested comfortable in the certain knowledge that its people were on balance doing their best with the material available to them. The harbor was quiet. The boats were in. The spruce forest at the edge of town stood in its permanent argument with the wind. Everything was, all things considered and with appropriate nuance, more or less fine.